I think I got it. Hello, and welcome to the Laugh at Pat podcast, #Patchats. I am very excited for today's guest, and this was a really fun conversation I'm excited to share with you guys. I'm going to continue with the tradition of Laugh at Pat broadcasting excellence. It's a foundational part of the Laugh at Pat podcast and network that I never take the time to learn the correct pronunciation of any of my guests when I'm speaking to them, or take the time afterwards to clarify the correct pronunciation of the names of my guests afterwards. And so here we go, another possible butchered last name. My guest today on the show is comedian Chris Doering. Now, again, I might have butchered his last name. However, if you want to find more of Chris right now, if you've heard enough, if you're already like, I'm sold on the name alone, you can find his social media in the description below, as well as links to some of the different comedy events that he runs here in Berlin if we ever get to start doing some fucking shows again. And so, yeah, I met Chris. He runs one of the an open mic here in Berlin called Laughing Spree, which was a really fun open mic that was nice enough to have me on several times. And he seemed like a really interesting, cool guy. And so I reached out and asked if he would be willing to come over and talk a little bit with me. And I had expected that we would talk, about comedy. I had known he had lived in Mexico. I wanted to hear about that. But I had just recently watched a Netflix documentary series about the period in Germany right after the wall came down that kind of led up to reunification and what was really going on during that period. And I knew he had grew up in Berlin kind of somewhat around that time period. And so the first part of the podcast, I was basically just quizzing him on questions I had after having watched that documentary series about, some of the layers to the East and West Germany dynamic and where that stuff stood today. And we kind of went down what I felt like was an interesting path of talking about German politics that I was not expecting. And I have to say, in my memory, there were a few jokes in there, but I have to say, not nearly as funny as Chris is on stage, of course. But we had an interesting. I got to answer some questions for myself about that, and we talked a little bit about his life, kind of traveling and living in different regions of the world, and we also talked about comedy, creative process, writing. And it was a really fun conversation, and it was really nice to get to talk to him. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode. So I think I should probably right about now shut up and get into it. So, of course, if you're listening to the audio-only version, get on YouTube, find the links to find Chris, and, also subscribe to my channel, because if you're listening to the audio-only, you want the video. The video adds an extra element, I feel. The video adds an extra element. But without further ado, here it is, my conversation with Berlin-based comedian Chris Doering. Enjoy. Okay, so we had Chris had me. I was rolling on the floor in laughter. It was, honestly, I think maybe some of the best comedy that's ever been done on the internet, and I failed to record the audio.
Yeah, people will never know what this once in a lifetime performance is like.
But I think that's the beauty of comedy. It lives in your and I's hearts.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yes. Sure.
Yeah. No, but you're right. Let's, maybe you can make a few tweaks and,
yes.
punch it up a little bit.
I think that's a good idea. You missed this great improv I did on just the Friends theme.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the record, at that point, I yes-anded it. But this time I'm going to just, move on with my tail between my legs. And so just very quickly, I complimented you on your lovely comedy events and open mics that you host. And then we started talking about you being born in Berlin.
Right.
You were born 5 years or so before the wall fell.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I was saying how great of a time I had. No, you were asking me sort of if I still have any memories, and my point was that yes, obviously, sort of as most of you can probably not remember as much from when you were 5 years old. We still have some memories that then somehow get sort of meshed up with, the incepted memories from the stories and everything you're being told while you're growing up about yourself or about the time. So I have that same thing, and yeah, I was talking about this one specific memory, sort of, where my aunt, who's 2.5 years older than me, she was induced into this organization that we used to have in socialist countries, which is kind of like the Boy Scouts, but with Marxist ideology.
Okay.
Which, to be fair, is the perfect place for that.
Do you join by like taking your favorite toy and breaking it apart and handing a little
handing
piece
it to two more people? Yes, exactly. This is how everybody gets to share. Exactly.
Now none of us can play with it,
but we all have something. We all share in the misery.
Yeah.
I think that's probably an apt description of like socialism. We all share in the misery. Yeah. And so I have that sort of strong memory of her sort of tying this ribbon around, because that's how you get inducted. Like you have the thing, you have the uniform, and then as you progress through the levels, you have differently colored ribbons. So she was tying that, and I was looking at that, and I was obviously very proud of her. Because as you all, I was like, great. And I was just thinking, oh yes, 1.5 years. That's gonna be me.
Yeah. That's gonna be your ribbon.
That's gonna be my ribbon. Spoilers alert: the wall came down.
Oh no!
And all my dreams died with it. so then, I was heartbroken over this terrible tragedy.
That's the untold story of this historical event. You're no ribbons. All the children's in East Germany.
All the trauma.
We're ribbonless.
We're ribbonless. Yeah, exactly. And but the point I was trying to get to earlier is sort of like what a lot of people don't realize is just as much as sort of the political system changed more or less overnight, sort of everyday life situation only slowly changed. So that whole period of the 90s was still very much from the way people behaved and sort of just other things around, still very much I wouldn't say overshadowed, but it was sort of like there's still a lot of impression from sort of socialist times. So and then growing up through that, you still get a lot of those like after waves, let's say.
Yeah, I just watched this documentary series on Netflix called like The Perfect Crime or something, and it's about that period, and it's super interesting because from an American perspective, which as you grow up, you start to realize like, wow, the way we teach our history is pretty one-sided there. Really only one perspective. But like what is interesting is like I feel like the kind of my perspective about the wall coming down was like the wall came down and everybody was so happy and like what a great thing, and people were like yay, David Hasselhoff was there,
but he personally brought the wall down for all of us, so just by his bad singing, like the story of Jericho in the Bible, that was him for us.
He's your biblical character.
He is a very biblical character. I feel, isn't he?
It's true.
No, but I mean that's just the way it is. I mean, not to be too cynical, but sort of this sort of way of news almost being sort of propaganda or very much sort of one side is something that we find today just as much. I know that, for instance, in East Germany, there's a lot of people who are not super happy about the fact that sort of the media landscape as it is now in the unified Germany is very much dominated sort of by the way West Germany used to run its news and still runs its news. So therefore, coverage of anything related to Russia or the East Bloc is pretty much the same as it was in the 1970s, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, and then a lot of East Germans are here, and it's like, okay, this is bullshit, and we know that, because like we know people who live there, or we have relatives, or we used to live there ourselves, you know, so it's like, we know this is bullshit, so why are you trying to sell this to us, you know?
Yeah. Well, that was the interesting thing about that documentary for me was, I mean, it was about the guy who was running that organization, who was in charge of like selling off all of the state-run companies or whatever.
Hunt,
yeah. And at the end of the series, spoiler alert, he dies. But
the wall comes down.
Yeah.
They build a second wall in the meantime,
Yeah.
just to close off the Treuhand, if only. Anyway.
But like they were saying that only 6% of all of the state-run companies ended up being owned or run by East Germans, and like everything else was basically outside or West German people. And that was an interesting part of that series for me, was the perspective of like, oh, there was, I mean, like a philosophy, and there were things that were not working in like the GDR, but it wasn't necessarily like the wall came down and everyone was like, fuck yeah, McDonald's, get in here. Like, come on, you knucklehead. Like, let's do this thing.
Although that is kind of what happened, because as always, like, it's a very complex issue. I mean, you know what? The song you would love to hear, or you should be hearing, we should be checking this out later, is by this Berlin band called Die Ärzte, which is Hip Hip Hurra, which is exactly that. It's sort of like a sarcastic take on how happy we all are, sort of that the times are changing so much. And, but... as always, because the story that you always are being told, and that's also the story that you see, there is this, I don't know if you've been to Friedrichstraße, they have this little museum next to it, because it used to be one of the checkpoints there between East and West Berlin.
I don't think I've been.
They call it a Palace of Tears, Palast der Tränen,
okay.
right? Because it used to be the stop when people sort of would go one way or another, and then they would sort of leave their families behind if they would work somewhere or wherever. And the story you see there being told about that time is sort of like, you see everyone going out in the streets and saying like, yeah, we want this state to end, we want to be one unified Germany, and then this famous quote, wir sind das Volk, we are the people, right? Much less known, because much less publicized, is that there's sort of another faction, smaller, granted, that's sort of saying, wir bleiben hier, we're gonna stay here. So, because there was a big faction, and sort of the whole story of 1990, not the 1990s, but the year 1990 is basically how there's like loads of people who want to see this as a time of the regime changing. They're basically going like, oh, look at this. And the big word there was sort of the third way. Because they're basically looking at this and saying, okay, so the way we've been running this is terrible. We don't want to be ruled by old people who still believe in like Stalin.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is not our jam as much. We like our photos.
Turns out Stalin was killing everybody.
Turns out, yeah, exactly. No, we like our photos unaltered.
Yeah.
So they were then basically sort of thinking, okay, wait, so we don't really want that. We want our own state, but that's still kind of a socialist state, because at the same time they're looking at West Germany or the West in general and sort of saying like, that's not really great either. So we'd rather have like an actual democratic socialist state.
Yeah.
So there was that faction, and then there was another faction which is like all about these sort of round tables that were happening at the time, was just sort of local people who civil rights. There was a civil rights movement essentially. So people saying, okay, we got to change all this, we got to change the laws, and we got to make this participatory. And they essentially just got screwed over by people then like saying, you know what, round tables, we don't need that. Why don't you guys just join us? Us being sort of the West German states. And that's how it actually happened. Sort of the East German states joined the West German states within the FGR. And that's our unified Germany now. And then the fact that you pointed out is, this is not funny at all, but it's just just facts.
But I mean, for me, I was like, since I wasn't also like planning that, like, oh, we're gonna really get into the
let's get into East German history.
East German history,
the sexiest of histories.
Yeah, and funniest. You know, that's what people don't know.
True, that is true.
No, but I don't know. I just watched that, and then I was like, I would be for someone, because for someone who didn't realize, you know, kind of how tumultuous like terrorist attacks and like assassinations and like kind of, I don't know, like pretty crazy compared to where we are today, 30 years later in Germany as like, you know, one of the world powers, really. Like, I just thought it was in the perspective of like you also growing up and being like a teenager and like, I mean, so you were 10 or so in 1995 and like, did the city feel dangerous at that time? Like, could you go out and just play wherever or?
I mean, first of all, the other thing I have to mention is sort of I didn't grow up just in Berlin because I grew up in a bunch of different places because my parents were students when I was born.
Okay.
So my parents were 18 when they had me. And so we then moved to a place called Jena in Thuringia where both of them studied. And so I wasn't just in Berlin. But yeah, in general, it's like it's a typical thing. It's just like for you as a kid, everything seems normal the way it is.
Yeah.
So it was fine. You know, we're just left alone to roam the streets as children, and so that's what we did.
Yeah,
it's fine. So no, I wouldn't call it sort of a dangerous time. It was an extremely tumultuous time, but like. You as a kid were mostly sheltered from that. It's sort of like families breaking apart on an economical and political level, so that doesn't impact you quite as much, or not as overtly as a child. So because your parents aren't really talking to you about it.
Scheiße capitalism drops at the...
exactly. Like every day we're just Scheiße capitalism.
The other thing I was wondering about, like from a child's kind of perspective is, you know, like a lot of like kind of like the culture and stuff, it seems like in Berlin now has grown out of the fact that there were these like kind of like abandoned industrial areas and abandoned buildings that people were able to kind of like artists were able to like breathe life
for
into.
A time, we should say. It's not really the case anymore.
Yeah, for a time.
Yes.
But so then being a kid, was there also just like cool like abandoned factories that you guys could just go like mess around in and stuff?
I remember there were a couple sort of buildings that we played around and they were abandoned. So yeah, I don't know if that's sort of an experience sort of for everyone, but it just happened in our case that there were like one or two buildings like that in our neighborhood. But that is also related to the documentary you're watching because the fact that they were there is mostly due to the fact that they essentially got shut down and nothing happened with them anymore, and then they couldn't find new owners for them, and that's the reason why they were abandoned. I mean, these places were not abandoned previously, right? They were in use. And so it's so funny that we're talking about this because I was talking to Daniel Olel about this a couple of days ago because he was visiting us, and it's just interesting because he's sort of coming from an Ugandan perspective. It was really interesting how he sort of could connect a lot of those dots that are happening sort of in the relation between East and West Germany. Because one of the facts, because you pointed that out, is sort of like there's only 6% of East Germans that actually own, was it companies that you mentioned? Or
I think it was, the state-run like companies.
Exactly. So that ended up in East German hands. And so that's... spoiler alert, the situation had changed very much. I think it's like 9% now. So progress, people. No, but that is one of the big frustrations that is still lingering in East German society, that essentially all our leadership, may it be political, societal, legally, politically, they're all basically from West Germany. And so all the professorships, all the judges, all the sort of the representatives in the parliament. Even I had a little fun project, and I think it was 2008, where I was studying in Saxony, in Dresden, and I looked at the state parliament of Saxony and looked at, okay, how many people who are in the state parliament were actually grew up in Saxony or East Germany, and were not that many. Like most of the representatives there were from somewhere else, and that just it's kind of a crazy situation if you think about it that way. Because cynically, and I've heard this, which is nonsense. Sort of we're like an occupied territory, which we're obviously not, but it's still sort of a weird situation. Most importantly, that it's still ongoing 30 years later. Because the idea at the beginning was, well, you have all this leadership from socialist times that they're in Germany say politisch belastet, which means you're burdened by your political background. Therefore, obviously, you cannot stay in that position, right? So they have to get rid of them. So they install all of these third tier, fourth tier people from West Germany. Couldn't make it over there. So installed them to help
They're
us
not
out.
good enough to be our leaders, but why don't you give them a try?
give it a couple of people, you know. And so just sort of I guess the idea was to sort of just jumpstart that process to integrate it with West Germany. But yeah, it just sort of become the fact now that they just never left. They either stayed in that position and again, on an individual level, all of that is understandable because they're basically then looking for successors while they're looking within their own networks, and their networks to the largest degree still is within West Germany, because this is another I find shocking thing. Like, for instance, when I looked into the state parliament at the time, so what a lot of these had, so for technical reasons you need to have a residence in that state, otherwise you don't qualify to stand election state. But so a lot of these still had a residence outside, so there were people like in Bavaria who had a residence in Bavaria, they had their family in Bavaria, and I'm guessing most of their friends and other type of network people in Bavaria, they would just sort of travel to
and they have an
Saxony.
Exactly,
whatever. They have an apartment there, would travel to Saxony for as many times they have to be. So the technicality is obliged, and then to be in office in Saxony. It's just weird stuff like that. And that's just an anecdote, just one of those things. But there's a couple of things like that where people from the West would come over here, work here Monday to Friday, and then would go home.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Totally.
And it's just, it's some of those things are just really crazy. And again, to me, the craziest thing is that it's still ongoing this many years later.
Well, that was the thing I wanted to ask you about, actually, that I thought was kind of interesting, is like, so, I mean, I guess part of it maybe is that like a lot of my friends here in Berlin, now that I think about it, I mean, grew up probably more in West Germany, you know, but so maybe that's part of why it's not spoken about. But do you feel like for the generation that's maybe like one generation below you that's younger, do you think that the idea of like East Germany and West Germany is something that they still think very much about? Because my perspective on like, you know, most of my like German friends who are in their 20s, to me, it just seems like they just see it as like, it's just Germany. And and even like watching with my girlfriend who's German about this documentary series, she was like, yeah, I mean, we didn't cover a lot of this in school even, you know, it was mostly like, you know, as it is like World War II heavy. And
it's probably also a good thing that they cover that extensively.
I mean, yes, I think that's valid. But I mean, it's interesting to like, I was wondering, do you maybe have more contact with younger people who grew up in East Germany? And is that still something they think about? Or is this also kind of like an issue or cause that is going to slowly kind of like get lost because the younger generation
I think it heavily depends on those people's situation, what socioeconomic and even local context they're embedded in. My probably closest contact to that is my sister, who's now, I'm not going to say how old she is. She's 12 and a half years younger than me. And
he's going to make you do the math.
Exactly. And so she's sort of a generation below me, essentially. Well, not a full generation, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so, and yeah, to her, and sort of, I also do teach a little bit at the university. So most of the people there, like first semester, they're like between 18 and 21, right? And to a lot of them, at first, even if they're from East Germany, it doesn't make that huge of a difference. Interestingly enough, because I used to teach a seminar on social inequality, and if there's always one lesson about Germany as well, because it was sort of a global thing, but there's one lesson about Germany specifically as well, and sort of East-West contrast. And interesting enough, the more you get them talking a little bit and sort of just point the finger into it, the more they will sort of open up and actually figure out, oh yeah, that there is certain differences, there's certain things. And most of the kids from the West typically have to say, I was like, why do we even need to talk about this? I mean, this is just counterproductive. The big phrase in like the 90s and the 2000s was always like the wall in our heads needs to go away. Like that's the biggest issue. It's just people still living in the past. That just needs to go. And the reality is, as long as it's a socio-political and socio-economic factor, and a huge factor at that, it'll always be a difference. That's just what it is. You can, just because of regional differences, it will never be possible that it's exactly the same. That's just not. However, as long as growing up in the East, being born in the East, will have a significant impact statistically on the chances that you have in life compared to any other region in West Germany. As long as that's still the case, as long as it'll be a problem, and politically as well, because comes down to the problem of right-wing nationalism and Nazis in East Germany as well, which is I feel connected to all of that as well.
Yeah, born out of a lack of opportunity.
Exactly. Frustration, lack of opportunity. Frustration that's also intergenerational, but it's just passed down, sort of like, this is all nonsense. Like, we're all losers in the 90s. Now my kids are losers here as well. There's a brain drain happening, so all the brightest and smartest minds, they're all leaving, they're all gone. So what are we left with, right? And out of that frustration comes this tendency towards this group, these people who basically say, hey, you know what? You can have everything you want, and the only ones you need to beat up is those guys.
Yeah.
You know, which, ironically enough, most of the Nazi organizations in Germany also had their leadership imported from the West. You know, like the AfD and all of those, like NPD, all of those like local chapters. Like most of those were not really homegrown. They were sort of like brought over.
That was something else that they talked about in that, was that it was like there was a much stronger like anti-fascist, anti-Nazi sentiment in the philosophical fabric of the GDR. Okay, so one last political question. And then
I'm sorry, and we don't want to make this whole about the whole episode, but I do want to point that out, because you also got to be honest about this. And I feel specifically with that sentiment of we're left behind, sort of frustration, GDR people or people in the East, you also got to be honest. Like, it wasn't all rosy, it wasn't all great. Like, for instance, this whole thing, we've got this very anti-fascist sentiment. That is true to a degree, but I think, and there are some studies about this, that as much as we sort of as a shield and sort of openly politically said, oh no, we're against the fascists, against the imperialists, they didn't as much sort of really weed it out as much either, because we always look at West Germany and say like, oh, those guys are just literally the same people. Yeah. And that's true. Like, most of their political leaders and most of these people, they're the same people that were there for the Third Reich, right? In East Germany, it was always like, no, we're completely different. Everything is different. But on a local level, like, nobody was hounding like just the very small people and really checking up on them. So you really don't believe in that anymore? No, we don't. Okay, good enough for me.
Yeah.
So
check that off the list.
Check that off the list. Gone. On to the next village.
Yeah.
So we got to be honest about that in terms of like how strong that anti-fascist sentiment really was. So in political life, for sure, absolutely, like in public political life, there's no way you could get away with that sort of thing. But no one was really checking sort of privately with people were still believing. So that's true. And the same, for instance, true, because that's also a big point of frictions in terms of women's rights. Sort of like everything was rosy, like women's rights were much more advanced in East Germany, which to a degree is true. But at the same time, what you find is that most of the time, a lot more women were working in East Germany, but they were then also doing house chores. So they were just doing all of it, you know? So it's not like we were a lot less patriarchal in East Germany. It's just like we needed women to work. Yeah. Because otherwise...
you can do both, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You've got some time.
It's got some time on your hands. Yeah. Put that kid down for a second. Come on.
Just come in the factory, 7-8 hours, and then just, cook and clean and do all the other stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry,
what was the last question?
So the last question I wanted to ask about politics, and then we can get back a little bit more to your story, is what's interesting to me is like my understanding also of the German political system now. Like, I've had some like kind of long conversations about it, and there's so many parts of it that seem like it works so much better than the system in my country. But even like with like the Green Party or like the Labour Party, to me, maybe I just don't know, but it doesn't seem like there's like a strong like democratic socialist party that I would have thought would come from like, okay, in the East, that was kind of like the third way, right? Like a strong democratic socialist way. So do you have any feeling?
You could argue that Die Linke, like the sort of the leftover, they always say there is the leftover of the SED, which was the ruling party in East Germany, which was then known as the PDS throughout the 90s, and then they joined with the little parties, left-wing parties in the West to join Die Linke, the left. You could argue that's a democratic socialist movement, essentially. But that's interesting. I don't know necessarily why that is, because I feel most of those civil rights people, it's probably that we're mostly just frustrated by nothing really happening, or by them being shut out of the process of then actually creating unified Germany. And also a big point for them was probably not being affiliated with any particular party. And then there's also friction between them and what they feel were just basically the SAD people in new colors, being the PDS afterwards. So I think they didn't really just found their own party per se, as much as there was a movement like that. It wasn't really organized.
Yeah. Well, okay, interesting stuff, but we can move on from the German politics now.
The funny thing about that is, as much as we always say, like, oh, don't talk about politics, in the end, politics is life, politics is a way of us living together and how we organize it, so sort of our life and our life story is intertwined with politics, there's no way to get around it.
And I think what's interesting about it, as you get a little bit older, it's like... I'm 30.
Not that you would know that, of
course. No, but it's just that also when you start to learn about kind of, the one narrative you had in your head that you're like, I think that was one chapter in a textbook that I learned about, and then you start to like get into the human details of it, and it's like, oh, this is like, so there, these were all these real lives, and it makes it a lot more.
Yeah, like for instance, my granddad and my dad, my uncle, my grandma, they used to live in Syria for about like 4 years.
Really?
In the 70s. Because Syria was sort of left-leaning at the time, and they were happy with just having sort of German, specifically German engineers over and sort of doing stuff there. And so, they lived in Damascus. My dad sort of went to the German school there. And so there's this whole thing about, for instance, my other granddad, one of my other granddads, because fun fact, I have several, about 4 of them, but no, because one part of my family just loves having a kid way too young, then splitting up and then having another kid. And
that's the blueprint.
That's the blueprint. They've done that for generations, just so we end up with many, many different families.
Just make the family reunions as complicated as possible.
Exactly. And make it sort of as widespread as possible. So one of them, he actually lived in Russia for a long time. So there's also this thing about sort of, we East Germans, like, we could never move, and like, blah, 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 blah. But at the same time, you could. If you wanted to. The biggest issue obviously was you had to be politically clean, as they say, meaning like if you had any sort of differing opinion to the ruling party, then you're fucked. And that was the biggest issue, probably.
Well, so how did to bring it back to you, how?
So during my rebel days, fighting the East German state.
But like you were like a teenager. And like in that time, like, in kind of this somewhat tumultuous time in the 90s, early 2000s, like, did you have a feeling of like, oh, I really want to like get out of Berlin and go somewhere else? Because I know eventually you went to Mexico, right? So how did that happen? Was that something you dreamed about, or was it just something that kind of came up?
Yes, Mexico, the country of my dreams. What shall I say? No. Well, the thing is, you're like, I want to see really what it was like to live on another side of a wall again. Exactly. It's like, walls are my thing. So I went to China first, just to see the mother of all walls. I did a wall tours around the world, the walls around the world, and no, just Mexico happened by happenstance, I would say. I wasn't really dreaming of sort of going away all that much. Having said that, I was in a privileged position in that both of my parents studied something very useful, unlike me. One became a doctor, the other one sort of studied law, and that put me sort of in a privileged position where then I was able to have a lot of opportunities. Like, for instance, I took an exchange year in the US.
Cool.
I overstayed my visa, which was also cool.
Were they chill about that when you
No,
left? Or?
not at all. They sent me letters, and they were really chill at the beginning, where it was like, so we would like you to come back. That would be nice.
Yeah. It's time.
It's time. And then sort of they got increasingly more frustrated until the last one. So you will probably send someone over to get you. I was like, okay, I think it's time. I think it's time.
You've said enough. That's
I get it now.
Yeah. It was a language barrier.
You weren't
thing.
really clear before on what you wanted precisely, but now I get it. You need to be precise. It's a German thing.
Where did you do your year in the
I was in
States?
Delaware.
In Delaware?
Yeah, I was in Delaware.
Honestly, most Americans will tell you Delaware is probably the nicest.
Delaware?
It's
Yeah.
it's one of the nicest places in the country.
I really enjoyed it. I mean, also it's in a very good position geographically. I find along the East Coast, because it's sort of close to everything.
That's
we're
true.
like an hour from Philly, so sometimes we would, like, friends of mine and I would go there, and then you're like 2.5 hours from New York, and about 2.5 hours to Washington as well. So I mean, it was just a pretty good location in my opinion, and I had a fantastic time. I was really happy to be there. I even had a chance then later on to go to the University of Delaware, and so that was just really cool in general. So
After you had already overstayed your visa, you were able
no,
to
that
go?
was during my
That was
overstay.
okay. Yeah.
No, I participated in one of those. They had like a program where high school students in certain AP classes, they could go to the university to take classes there while they were still in high school, and I did that. And then I was able through that program to do a couple more trimesters, I think it was, there at the university.
Nice.
Yeah.
So doing that, did that kind of give you a taste for I'm interested in living, other places? And
certainly, I think so. I think there was a huge impact in my life in terms of I definitely do want to see the world. I want to see as many sort of places as I can. And ironically enough, I mostly went to English-speaking countries afterwards, because then I went to New Zealand, Australia, I went to South Africa, and so I went to a couple different places and lived there for a while.
Oh, wow.
And that was fun.
Yeah.
And then I lived in the UK for about 2.5 years, I think. And then I met my girlfriend there. And when her visa was up and she had to go back to Mexico, that's then what brought up the idea of maybe going to Mexico as well. Because a mutual friend of ours. So what happened to us is that while we were in London, we never really got together. As in, there was always this sort of chemistry between the two of us. As we both met on the first couple of days that we were both there. A mutual friend of ours from France, she basically did one of those.
From friends?
Yes, of course. We're all very privileged people living in London. Never met any black people.
Just hanging out at a cafe.
Yeah, we never went to South London. No, so she sent one of those messages on, what was it, couch surfing, basically saying, hey, I'm new in the city. Does anyone want to join me to go to the museum? I think went to the Tate, if I remember, British Tate. And then there was about 20 of us who said, sure, I'd be up for that. And then out of those 20 was about 6 of us that really got along really well, and we're all kind of friends with one another still. She was one of those people. And then another mutual friend of ours at one point said, I don't get it. So this was 1.5 years afterwards. So I said, I don't get it. What's up with the two of you? There's this weird thing happening between us. I feel like I need to just put you two in the closet, lock the goddamn thing, and get you out 2 days later, just for one of you guys to finally make a move. And so then she left. Nobody had made any moves. And,
but there was a chemistry.
There was a chemistry for sure. And then that friend, while I was still in London, basically said, so this is such a weird thing. This has never happened. You know what you should go to Mexico. And I said, I don't know if that's such a good idea. What am I gonna do there? And she said, well, you're going to try and fuck her, number one. Very problematic.
Step one, do the thing you didn't do for 2.5 years here.
First of all, very problematic statement, right? So shame.
On behalf of the whole Laugh at Pat podcast, I apologize.
Shame on her, I would say.
Yeah.
But then the worst thing, here's what she said, and that's the thing that stuck with me. She said sort of, what's the worst thing that can happen? You're going to be in Mexico for 6 months, and then you go back. And I said, yeah, that doesn't sound that bad, does it? So you go there, you stay there for a little while, and it doesn't work out. But you've been in Mexico for 6 months, so that really doesn't sound that bad. And that's exactly what I ended up doing, except for I ended up staying for 3 years.
And...
Oh, yeah, it worked out.
It worked out.
That is my girlfriend and the mother of my children.
I stayed there for 3 years, still didn't make a move, but, the chemistry was there.
Chemistry was there. It's all about the chemistry, you guys. As a chemistry major. That's all what it's about. No, she's my girlfriend still, and she's the mother of my children. And so, yes, I think I can make a move now. Maybe we can ask her to dinner one of these days.
So I mean, also I feel like too the going into that situation, that's also the ideal situation, is if you can move to a place where you know someone who's from there.
Yes, and I was incredibly lucky in that sense that I was able to sort of not move in, but I stayed with them for a little while, and then they had another property that they wanted to rent out, and I was like, well, I can just live there and pay off your mortgage, essentially. And so that was really lucky in that sense, that obviously I immediately sort of was hooked up with the network.
Did you work there, or
I ended up working there illegally, and no, I
we talk a lot about illegal immigrants.
Yes, no, because that's exactly why I went to Mexico in the first place. I wanted to be an illegal immigrant, see what that's all about. I wanted to steal their jobs, fuck their women, see how it makes them feel. They didn't like that joke either. At first, so the way I tied that in organizationally is I went over there for sort of a study visit. So I was a visiting research a researcher. A visiting research person is what I just wanted to call myself, and I thought that's a weird way of putting it. No, it was a visiting researcher.
Well, it's appropriately non-gendered, so I appreciate that. And so
I was a visiting research person at this university in Cancun, and so I was doing that for a couple of months.
What are you researching in Cancun? Cancun has a reputation in the States as
for all the pauses that they see of Cancun. Yes, exactly. So what most people don't know in the US perhaps is that outside of the hotel strip, there's also a city.
Really?
Really? Yes. It's sort of the shithole of Cancun.
Wait, so that's where the people who work at the resorts.
But that's funnily exactly how Cancun started, because it was literally they started it in the 70s as a tourist resort, and then a couple years later they figured out, oh, this is great. We've got this fun hotels. This is really cool. Mass tourism is picking up. This is working out so well. You guys live here now. Because you work here. You can't really travel between Mexico City and Cancun every day, can you? Yeah, I guess we're gonna build a couple of shacks over here. So, and I heard some wild stories from people sort of I met who were there during the 70s, and in terms of there was no, for years there was no toilet paper that you could find anywhere.
Oh shit! Yeah.
So some wild stories there, and this is essentially how the city of Cancun started. It's just a place where all the workers lived who worked in all the hotels. But then over time, as a city, it just developed, and now it's got a whole bunch of other industries that don't matter.
Yeah.
No, because this city completely lives by the tourism industry, right? And
is her family still there? Or
her family still lives there.
How are they doing with this year of I know Mexico's been publicly pretty open during the pandemic or whatnot,
Right.
but I'm sure it must have hurt the
Although-
tourism industry, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Cancun as a sort of economic zone is hit incredibly hard. Luckily, they don't really work in that industry as much. They came to Cancun themselves as musicians, so they used to then play in the hotels there a lot when they still were up for live music, and that was until the invention of the tape recorder. And when hotel owners decided, oh, I can just press this, play,
Yeah. I'll pay you one time and then not again.
bye-bye.
Yeah.
So then they sort of had to look for different kinds of work anyway. So that they work in different industries. So for them, it hasn't been as hard. Obviously, just like with what we find here, basically all these industries are interconnected. So even if your industry isn't affected directly, it'll come down the chain for you as well. And but yeah, luckily for them, it's not that hard. Cancun in general, pretty tough. However, I do have to say, in terms of sort of how openly they were, when I was in Mexico just a couple of months ago, that was in November. It was in November, actually. I was almost embarrassed by how well organized things were compared to here in Germany. Because you would go there and like every store, everywhere you were, they would have a person outside sort of checking everyone up, sort of like, you know, you're wearing your mask, here's a bit of hand sanitizer, sort of just checking up if everybody's following the rules. They would have an organization in terms of within the supermarkets, for instance, you had these like arrows on the floor. This is the only way you're supposed to walk around the place, right? And yeah, okay, we have too many people in, so you just gotta wait here. And then you come back here to Germany, and it's just mayhem. Like if you go to the supermarkets here, it's just absolute mayhem. And so I was quite embarrassed by sort of like, oh, this is developing country, they can learn a thing or two from us. It's like, no, we could probably learn a couple of things from them. And so yeah, it was almost embarrassing to see how, compared to Germany, well organized. You could still argue that it's not great in terms of how organized it was. It's still perhaps too open. But again, compared to what we're experiencing here, yeah, it was much better.
Yeah. So to kind of change gears a little bit here, when did you start?
What's with the car metaphors? Like, do you even own a car?
Actually, my car just died.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Helga, my Honda. We had such good times together.
I wouldn't know. I don't have a license, so.
Really?
No. I was in driver's ed in the US. I got a license there. But I was too old because they had a new rule apparently that was implemented that if you're 18 or older, you actually have to do the tests, so the theoretical and the practical test again at the DMV. Because what happened to me, I went, because most people here, when they have an exchange year, they go after 10th grade, so just before your A-levels. Well, I was mature enough to realize that I wasn't mature enough at the time, so I went after 11th grade, so in between my A-levels. And so that meant that when I was doing driver's ed and I was finished, I was already 18 years old, so I fell within the range of that new rule that I had to do the test there. So while I was at the DMV to get my license, they told me that, and I didn't know. And so I did the theoretical test right there, passed it, but then I couldn't do the practical test because they wouldn't give you a car. They basically said, you got to bring your car, your family's car, and then do the test here. And it's like, well, I can't.
Yeah.
because for obvious reasons, because my host parents, as nice as they were, so for insurance reasons, they couldn't just have me drive their car for this test. And then you also, here's the fun thing about that, you couldn't then get a car, like rent a car, because you had to be 21 or older to do that.
Yeah. Also, you can't you not? I don't think you can rent a car unless you already have a driver's license.
I had a provisional driver's license.
Okay,
so they give you. So in order to do that test, you don't have to do it right away. I just chose to do it right away. They give you like a bit of time, so you have a provisional license for, I don't know how long it was. I think it was like a month or 2 months. So with that, I could have technically rented a car if I had been older than 21. So I was in that dead zone between 18 and 21. When I came back here, I was trying to sort of get them to at least accept, listen, I've done all the courses, I don't need to do it again, because it's insanely expensive to do it here. Like it costs upwards of like €1,000 to do the whole thing to get a license. And I was like, I'm not paying that.
Yeah, and it's also like it's kind of common to like you don't to not pass the test and stuff, right? At least on the first time, and then it's like another 500 euros or something. Yeah,
exactly. I've like family and friends who swear that they were sort of being failed just in order to
just
have
to
them
get
pay
another.
again.
Yeah. Well, I want to turn on my turn signal to do a little lane change here.
I don't know what you're talking about. You're talking Chinese to me right now.
I want to throw it in reverse real quick.
All these fancy technical terms.
No, but I wanted to talk a little bit about comedy before you have to get out of here.
Right.
Like, so when did you start like performing, or like was that something that you were always interested in as a kid? Were you watching specials or certain comedy shows?
I think I was always like one of those kids who was just craved attention, like class clown syndrome type of thing. Even though that got a lot lower later, because my thing was I was really, I know it sounds weird when I say that I was a very small kid.
I thought you were going to say, the thing is, I was really smart.
I know it sounds weird when you look at me now, but I used to be very smart.
I was like so
but
smart.
Then I went to the US for a year. No, I was a really small kid to hit like a growth sport at like 14 or so. So I had that thing, that like Napoleon thing where you kind of need to prove yourself.
Yeah, totally.
So, just to get attention, you just always do just funny things. And it stuck with me, just sort of like, now I'm bigger, I'm like cooler, so I don't need to prove myself, but you still do.
Yeah.
Because that's your modus operandi right now, so that's just what you do. Although I did cool down quite a bit, so that I was able to then just sort of relax a lot more. And not be the class clown. Like sort of later then, so from like, what was this, like 7th grade or so, and 7th grade onward, I wasn't a class clown as much anymore. But anyway, so that sort of as a personality trait was sort of within me for a long time, and then I did like all the theater stuff, so I was like a theater kid a little bit, so I did like plays and stuff. I was in this youth group, and then they threw me out because I was too old.
They're like, you're not a youth anymore.
They're like, so
you had the beard you have now.
This is for students, and you're not a student anymore. Yeah. So, okay. And so what friends of mine and I did, who were sort of in the same situation, where it's like, well, there's no place for us to go really. We then decided, okay, well, we're just gonna do like theater exercises, and we had a friend of ours,
kind of like improv.
Yeah,
is that the same? Kind of.
We weren't really doing. I mean, part of theater exercises is you do improv exercises, but it's like just classic stuff, like also just reciting monologues and stuff, just doing that together as a group. And we had a friend of ours who was in a chess club, who had the keys to their office or the chess club training, whatever, which is just like this old building that they were in. And so we would just get his keys, and then we could meet there twice a week, I think we met. And so it was 4 of us, we did that. And even when we're in the youth groups, we all leaned more towards sort of the comedy stuff, the funnier stuff. And then after a while of just doing these exercises, we decided, okay, let's just run some stuff through, let's create some actual stuff. And then we wrote down some stuff, and then we decided, well, what are we going to do with all this shit? Well, let's just perform it. And that's how we got into cabaret, which is in Germany a very different tradition. So it has nothing to do with a cabaret. Well, nothing is probably wrong term, but it's not cabaret. It's not sort of scantily clad ladies. Yeah, it's scantily
in
clad
martini glasses.
Performing as ladies. So no, it's like more of the vaudeville tradition, sort of like stand-up, a cabaret. A lot of these different things come out of the vaudeville tradition of like the early 20th century,
and more of that kind of theatrical.
Exactly, it's a lot more theatrical. So if I was gonna describe cabaret to someone who doesn't really know what it is, it's most of the political, topical, sketch-based version of stand-up, which is nothing like stand-up. Yeah. Now that I've put all of these adjectives in front of it. So we did that, and we just did cabaret, but we did it sort of for students, for young people, because cabaret here in Germany is for old people. No, it really is, because I think like the average age is like 60 something. It's really crazy. There was like a comedy wave in the 90s in Germany where they did comedy, but it's not stand-up comedy, but it was like a comedy wave in terms of they didn't only talk about politics anymore, they also talked about like personal life, and not just
was that on
silly weird stuff. And that was on TV all around.
Okay.
And sort of the big comedy boom of the 90s. So that was sort of geared towards a younger audience, meaning now they were like 40.
Yeah.
The average age was now 40. And so we decided, okay, we're going to do cabaret. So in terms of the format, in terms of the style, but we're going to do it sort of for young people. And at that time, coming back from the US, I was heavily influenced by stand-up comedy, because when I got to the US, now I sort of learned my love of stand-up comedy, because I sort of found all this stuff. So this was a time, so I was there during the time when the Chappelle Show was on, and I watched that, and that became sort of a religion for everyone in my school. Like everybody was talking about it the next day after it aired. Like everybody was talking about it.
Some of those lines had like literally a decade's worth of follow through with my group of friends, where it's like,
I mean, you could still quote it today, and people are like,
we could probably recreate an entire Chappelle Show sketch.
And so through that, sort of seeing that guy, he doesn't just do the show, but he's also a stand-up comedian, and then going through like, there's George Carlin, there's Richard Pryor, Sarah Silverman, and so on. It's like all of a sudden you see this whole world opening up for me, and it's like, this is fantastic, because I did like comedy during the 90s when there was sort of a boom, and in German. And there were like a couple people trying to attempt to do it in a more stand-up-y way, let's say. So there is a guy called Michael Mittermeier, who's still around these days, who did, at least for me, very influential piece called Zapped, which was just about the TV program, and it was just making fun of all these weird sort of TV shows, essentially. Yeah. But it was just already sort of very different from everything that's come before. And so yeah, coming back from the US, sort of now I really love stand-up, and in fairness, most of the monologues that I ended up doing during my cabaret years in German were very stand-up-y. So they were already very sort of stand-up-like, and in fact, the most common complaint I received throughout all of those years is, you're too quick. Not in terms of like, you're super witty, you're too quick, but in terms of just, again, as the format goes, like, because cabaret is it's a very different rhythm. I always like it when you compare cabaret to stand-up, like it's like music, Cabaret is like jazz. It's like the din, the din, the din, the din, while stand-up is like rock and roll, sexy, cool. Yeah. And then when I moved abroad, afterwards, I learned very quickly that nobody likes jazz. So the thing is, just here in Germany,
you're like, wait, I'm getting to it. You're gonna love this part.
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of the way how cabaret works. It's sort of like you don't really have jokes and punchlines at the end. It's sort of like you have these amusing observations. So you go like la 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 la. There's like amusing turns of phrases in between to keep people's attention. And then you have like a political point, or like you have an observation to get to, not a punchline, right? So, and my thing was similar to stand-up. It's like bam, 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 bam. And people are like, wait, I was still on the other thing. You're already on the next thing. Like, this is not how this works. Yeah. It's like, I'm sorry. Yeah. I had a 60-year-old couple from Switzerland run out of one of our shows at a festival.
It was too funny. There were too many jokes.
Just too many jokes.
It was just like too many punchlines.
Just like the Swiss. That's too many jokes. So too fast. So it's just like that. The Swiss thing was no, but also they were appalled by just our material, because we're like talking about sex and stuff as well. And like, as you know, 6-year-olds don't have genitals anymore. So
just smooth like a Barbie.
They were just appalled by that. And so yeah, I was doing cabaret for a couple of years until I moved to England to realize that the English don't like jazz. And then I was like, okay, it's stand-up. I can try stand-up again. So I did I didn't do that much comedy while I was in England. I did a couple of gigs here and there. I went to a couple of those like open mics. I ended up going to like the comedy club and a top secret comedy club as well. I had a few performances here and there. Because the thing in the English scene, or the London scene at least, is like, unless you're sort of well embedded or well known, it's really tough to get gigs constantly. Like, it's not like in Berlin where it's just you sign up and then you're on the next night, and you can do that every night of the week, essentially. It's like there you're lucky if you get a gig every second week, you know.
Yeah.
And then you do like 3 minutes. It's like, it's really tough.
Was that like frustrating? Because I feel like part of the thing too is, right, like you start getting, like, you do something and you're like, okay, that didn't really work, but like it not working gives me an idea how to like move things around and try it again.
Exactly. And then
you
go like, well, I'm going to do it again next month.
Yeah.
Suckers.
Did that like kind of slow you down with the pursuing comedy thing, this not ability?
Yes,
or
I mean, also like just like everything, so if you're not doing it constantly, it's also not on the top of your head all the time, and there are other things in my life going on, so that I definitely slowed me down for sure. Like I wasn't able to pursue it as much as I did previously doing cabaret, even also just on the side, but it kind of got lost a little bit in the way, but I tried to do as much as I could. But then moving to Mexico, that's really where I sort of took a break. It was like a break of like 3 years, because there was not, surprisingly enough, the demand for English-speaking comedy in Mexico, not very high. No, because like, where are you gonna perform? Like there was one place I performed at once, I think, which was in a little south of Cancun, a place called Playa del Carmen, where they had like a club where they would have like an English night every month. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. But like I performed there once throughout those whole 3 years. Because also I remember that a couple of times it didn't happen. It's like they had it as a monthly occurrence, but it sometimes just wouldn't happen because nobody's interested in it. Which is funny in a place like Playa del Carmen, it's just touristically exploited. Yeah. But I think what they do is, at least that's what I've been told. For instance, like the major resort, the major hotels, they just bring in people. So if you have, like, for instance, doing spring break, everyone comes in and they just bring in a couple performers, a couple comedians who then perform at the resort for all the students who are there, right? So there's no need to have anything else. So, and therefore, there's no infrastructure there for English-speaking comedy, really. I'm probably being super unfair because I'm sure there's like some things there. Like I remember in Mexico City, there's like small things here and there. And I remember there was a club there once as well. So there's some things, but specifically where I was in Cancun and that region, so there wasn't really anything there.
And during that time, did you have a feeling of like were you really missing it, or were you just kind of like, well, this is kind of where my life is, it's fine? And then like, how did you was it like as soon as you got back to Berlin, you were like, oh, I'm like chomping at the bit to get on stage again? Right. Or was it just kind of like, oh, maybe I'll try this again?
Right. Well, it's like one of those things. I mean, it never really leaves you, so you just use it in other endeavors, right? So I ended up becoming an English teacher at this private school in Mexico. That's the part where I worked illegally, and it stays between us. Yeah. And so for instance, I made them write a play that I then directed. So as part of them learning English, I made them write a play in English and then perform it.
You're like, I have a few notes. Let's punch this up a bit.
Exactly. So then I've just found different outlets, and I was still writing at the time. I was just writing different stuff because that's the other thing. I think. I mean, you know this obviously. That comedy is a writer's profession. So even if you can't perform, the thing that you do most of the time, you can still do. No problem. You just write all the time. So I was just writing different stuff. Wasn't writing straight up jokes to perform. In a couple of nights from now, but I was just writing, and I just kept doing that. And then when I got back to Berlin, I was like, okay, it's time now. I was surprised to find out that there was an actual English scene here, because I assumed when we come back to Berlin, I guess I'll try to get into the poetry slam world, because that's what I did, for instance, when we were in cabaret. Because here's the other thing about cabaret. I was telling you about sort of the age gap in cabaret. Yeah. There was no opportunities for us to do anything. So most of the time, most of our performances, there were also, just like we do now, there were at bars. We would go to student clubs and student bars and go like, hey, you've got like a free Thursday, right? Can we just perform? Like, we have this thing, can we just perform it? And so we would do that, and then we would do festivals and stuff, but there's like no theaters you can go to. And we actually wrote to like a couple cabaret places and said, hey, we're like a young cabaret group. We're all like early 20s. Can we just perform for you? And even if you don't let us do that, can we just we will be the opening act. We'll do a warm up for your main thing, because a big thing in all performances is you need to warm up the audience, right? And in cabaret, they just don't do it. So the first 10 minutes of every cabaret piece, it's basically just kind of warming up the audience anyway. So, and we were basically, just give us those 10 minutes, we'll do it, right? And they were like, no. And the funny thing is, the one guy who's like the head of one of those cabaret theaters, while we had this interchange, it was a couple months later in the papers, I read an interview with him where he was going like, yeah, it's a shame, man. It's a shame, because in cabaret, it's like we have an age problem, and there's just no one coming up, it's just no one interested in cabaret. It's like, you motherfucker. Because there's no opportunities. Like, there's literally no like youth group, and the theater themselves doesn't organize anything. It's just like they expect them to come to them fully fledged, perfect, cabaret artists. And it's like, oh, you idiots. Yeah. This is just stupid. And
you didn't perfect your craft in front of the mirror.
Yes.
Like
what?
Yeah.
How is that possible? So I just so the way we did it is these places, and then in order to practice for those performances, we would go to poetry slams, and we would just try our like monologues or little scenes, and would just try them out in front of the poetry slam crowd, who loved it, of course, because they're always like, what the fuck are these guys doing? Because like we had this one thing where we were in hell, and we were playing two devils, so we would go in front of a poetry slam crowd, and just two devils doing just nonsense, and like all of these guys who would just listen to poems the whole night was just like, the fuck is this? What are these idiots doing?
They're like, wait, is this supposed to be a commentary on the socioeconomic differences between...
So I kind of expected, okay, I'll go back to Berlin. I guess I'll try my luck there and just try to be funny and at a poetry slam. And then I was very surprised to see, there's a big English scene here, actually. Even at the time, I felt it was big, even though it was nothing compared to today's standards. And so I went to a couple different mics to check them out. I went to The Nose. That was run by Mark Beadle at the Castle at the time, near Gesundbrunnen. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. I'll just sign up. I'll do it next week. So I signed up. I did it next week. It was awful, and I was like, I love it. I love it. I'm back. Yeah. Not making 3 people laugh. That's exactly my jam.
Taking something I think was great to deafening silence. Lovely.
That's the way to go. And then just sort of entered the scene, and then progressively it got worse. I just got deeper and deeper into it, until the point where I sort of decided with a friend of mine is like, fuck this, we're gonna open our own place. Because like then, like I said, as much as I felt it was big, like if you actually want to get into it and perform regularly, basically perform every night, it wasn't big enough for that. To consistently get on every night and to get the stage time that I wanted. So I was like, fuck it, then I'll create my own place, and I can decide how much daytime I get, right? Because then I'm just gonna have the audience and the comedians suffer through my set for 40 minutes. And it was like that. The first maybe even the first year, I remember, I did my intro was like 30 to 40 minutes. Like nowadays the intro is like,
you're like, 15. I warmed them up, I cooled them down, and here you go.
Yes, that's exactly how it went. Although I do have to say, after I've perfected, or you would generally, not just me, but like you would perfect it to such a degree where after 40 minutes you have them properly riled up and ready to go. Now I struggle with that a little bit, because we sort of, Dragic and I have decided we're gonna clip it to 12 to 15 minutes tops, which I find for an intro is really short. I mean, it's good. I like it because we keep the whole show very snappy, sort of an hour and a half tops, which I like. Well, that's not true. For the open mic, it's like an hour and a half to hour 45 minutes, let's say. And so I like that it's snappy, because it helps the show overall that it's that short. Yeah. But I do find that sometimes it's rough if the audience is slower or you're slower just to get them going. It just happens a couple of times, not as often, but it happens a couple of times. So they're just not ready when you bring out the first comic, and so I know from like previously, normally I would have just taken more time. I would have taken another 10, maybe another 15 minutes just to get them really ready.
Well, I have to say, from my experience, one of the reasons I loved performing at your guys' open mic was just that I always felt like, you guys did a great job of like warming up the crowd, and actually you said something to me once, one of the first times I went there, but you were saying just kind of that, like, to, in less words, but like to also enjoy that, like, sometimes when it is like a more challenging audience, like to enjoy that challenge and take that like kind of learning opportunity there to, that, like, that's a chance to sharpen your skills as well. True. Like if the audience isn't totally on your side.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like everyone always says, like, it's through bombing experience that you learn the most. It's just getting through those sets first of all, just to sort of survive it without doing seppuku afterwards. But then also exactly just looking at it, reflecting over, okay, is there any way I can salvage this? If you can find that within the moment somehow, you find that turn, you find a way to sort of save the whole thing, perfect. Even if you don't, look back at it and just sort of figure out, okay, where did I go wrong? Like, what can I do here? What tools can I get? Can I create for myself, or can I find to work with those situations?
Yeah. Well, I want to be think about your time and whatnot.
By the way, can I ask you questions as well?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Because one of the things I find super fascinating about you when you speak about yourself in your sets is sort of that you said that you're the son of two lesbians, right?
Yeah.
So I always wondered, since we spoke about my childhood quite, but I was wondering sort of how performative that was you, because in you growing up, because I imagine children being children, you heard a lot of encouraging words about your family situation at home and how everyone admired you.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that definitely is where some of my sense of humor comes up. The thing I always tell people is, like, I don't think that, like, kids were necessarily, like, kids aren't homophobic. It was just, I was
their parents.
No, but I think, like, I was just a weird kid.
Right.
And so that was, like, a weird thing about me to say something about, but there was, like, like, I don't know, like,
What's a weird thing about you?
Like, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with the comic Garfield, and I had, like, a stuffed comic? Garfield that I would, like, bring to school every day, and I had, like, a Garfield backpack, and, like, just like,
obsessed with Garfield.
I was obsessed with Garfield, but, like,
ironically, hated lasagna. I loved Garfield. Hated lasagna.
Lasagna is trash. Garfield is the one thing he had wrong. Odie is a bitch, though.
I hate dogs to this day. Got a whole, like, actually behind this is a whole cemetery of dogs.
With those little Garfield things people would put on their cars on the gravestone.
Yes, exactly.
But I think also the thing about growing up with two moms is, like, I mean, I definitely was. They weren't like, oh, you should do more sports. They were more like theatrical. And I remember when I was like 13, it was my friend's birthday, and we had done all these plays when we were kids. And his mom was like, everybody come in. We're going to watch a VHS of, like, the play you guys did when you were 6. And, like, everybody's going on, and it's, like, fun and funny. And then I come out, and I'm in, like, a white turtleneck with just, like, a fully bedazzled banana sewn onto it, like, hello! Like, just,
fantastic.
As a 13-year-old guy trying to, like, fit in
with the bros.
Like, let's play some Halo after this. That was not a great.
I'm gonna banana that squad leader.
So I think that also was, and I was
helpful
an only child.
in your journey.
So I was I was an only child.
Oh, a lonely child, yeah.
An only child.
Yeah.
So
that is what I said. Yeah. Incorrectly.
Not lonely. I was definitely not lonely.
I'm so happy.
It was a great childhood. I loved it. To wrap up, the last thing I wanted to ask about, do you have a car metaphor for me to bring this up, or
does transition work? No, that's too broad. That's not car specific enough.
I wanted to pop the hood on the
Reverse-
comedy
okay.
writing process.
Reverse into.
Yeah,
Okay.
But I always, because this is my show and so
I get to do
I get to do
what I
whatever I
want.
want. But for me, one of the fun things about talking to like other comedians is like asking about the writing process, because I don't know, that's something that I'm very much still like figuring out. And certainly during this like pandemic time, I feel like a lot of times I like find some idea that I think is funny, and I know that it's not funny yet, but I'm like, I feel like there's something here, but without being able to like go and try it out and stuff, it's been hard for me. Like, do you fully write out like a full joke? Do you write out like exactly kind of what you would say? Do you write like what is your writing process, and do you have a schedule that you try to keep to, or?
I used to. That's one of the things that I found very challenging with having kids, and then also sort of having not a sort of a stable routine really with work life as well. Is I used to have a schedule, where I would have like 1.5 hours per day that I just set aside from like 1 to 2:30. It's my writing time. I do that and just write, and that's it. And now it's a lot more sporadic, because I don't have that set schedule anymore, which I'm kind of trying to get back into, to sort of find that time somewhere. But it's difficult to coordinate sort of with the family, to have sort of very specific time frame, because also our schedule sort of changes constantly from week to week. And but yes, in terms of sort of how I write, yes, I do that. I like write out normally. I try to write out the whole idea that I have, so that is actually in words, like the way I would phrase it. Because I find a lot of times what I did, because I think we're all in the same way, in the sense that we're trying to figure it out. We're constantly, and we'll probably still be the same in like 20 years, you're still trying to figure out how to do it properly, because you always have this imposter syndrome. I'm not doing it right. Like, everybody has it figured out but me. Yeah. And but what I found for myself is, when I previously did it with just sort of the notes, this is the general idea, I riff around it, I always found that I had sort of specific phrases that I thought, this is exactly what a funny is, that I would then lose if I don't have it written down. So I would try to write it down exactly, and then figure out, is there a couple of those phrases in there, sort of a couple of metaphors, analogy, that have to be said exactly like that in order to actually make it funny? Or is this something that is, as a premise, so good that you can just riff off of it, and it doesn't really matter what you say specifically? But then through the editing process and sort of economy of words, you can kind of just whittle that down to something really workable and very strong. But I found, for me personally, it just works best if I have it written down, and that also helps me personally in just editing it down to something where I go like, okay, this is a tight version now, and that tight version I can now say more or less verbatim. Most of the time, unless it's a joke that I've really done for like a year or year and a half, I will sort of play around with it, and it will change sort of from evening to evening a little bit anyway, except for like the key phrases. Like, if I identified something in the joke that just has to be like that, then that will be the key phrase that I will say exactly the same over and over again, and just sort of rearrange the words around it.
And the editing process, is that something where it's like, okay, you write out the whole thing, and then you, are kind of, it's like turning around in your head, and then at some point you're in the grocery store and you're like, oh shit, if I move this part? Or is it something where you sit down and then, you're like, I'm going to come back to this in a day. You reread the whole thing, and you're like literally taking out lines or moving words around? Or what does that look like?
That's typically through like notes on my phone. Used to be mostly like notes on like Scrivener or whatever on my laptop, but now it's mostly on my phone, where sometimes you figure out like the thing from this one idea that you had actually works really well with the other idea, and all of a sudden you have a new joke that's much better than the other two stupid things that you thought about. And and it just, whenever it happens to you, just write it down immediately, because it's the worst thing where you go like, oh, we're in the middle at the dinner table, we'll just have dinner, I'll write it down later. And it's like, what was it again? It's like something with air.
It was so funny. It was going to be my closer.
Hilarious. And so I just found that you got to write it down immediately. You got to say, wherever you are, whatever situation, I'm sorry, and then you just got to write it down. What happens to me a lot is, after I've done something, or after I wake up, or while I'm on the loo, that's sort of when it's like, oh, okay, boom, got to write it down now.
Yeah, I've had that a lot where right as I'm falling asleep, I think of something, and then I'll be like, this is too good. I'll remember this in the morning.
Yes.
And then it's just all I remember is that I had a good idea.
Exactly. And that's so frustrating, right? Because you're so convinced. It might not even have been that good, but you're so convinced that it was such a brilliant idea that you sort of chuckled inside. You chuckled so much. And then it's like, yeah, I've had that as well, where sort of you fall asleep. And because as you're falling asleep, your mind is still racing. You're thinking of things and like you're thinking of funny things to say. And it's like, oh, no, I'm not going to turn over and just grab the phone or stand up to go get the phone if it's charging somewhere. That's just too much work. I'll remember this. It's so funny. How could I possibly forget about this? Yeah, for sure. I've had that as well.
Yeah.
And sort of there's I just feel like we're all kind of just figuring out, because I talk to other comedians about the same thing as well, and like as far as I can tell, everybody's sort of saying the same thing. Is like, I'm just trying to figure it out, man. Yeah. It's like whatever process I have is terrible. You've got the answers, right? No, I don't. This guy does. No, I don't either.
Somebody must have the answers.
Exactly. Where's the magic bullet that lets me write perfect comedy?
Yeah. Well, do you have anything else you want to add before we wrap it up here?
Not
Maybe,
really.
where
to
people...
stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Yeah.
So we can finally get back to this.
Yeah. Maybe where people can find you online or...
As you pointed out, so I run shows around Berlin. So if you're ever in Berlin, if you're from Berlin, then just come to our shows. We do shows under the monikers of Laughing Spree, Propaganda Comedy, and we do run quite a couple shows in Europe as well. So even if you're not from Berlin, you can still get to see our comedy. We do like these tours. We have like a Nordic tour. We've got a tour through like Western Europe and so Central Europe. So just, check out Propaganda Comedy, and you can find us there on Instagram, Facebook, the whole shebang.
All the platforms.
All the medias.
Yeah.
All the socials and all the medias.
And I will put the link to those in the description below.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, man. This was super fun.
Yeah. That was
awesome.
Fun.
Yeah.
So much fun talking about East German politics.
Yeah. It was a hot way to start the podcast.
Yes. This is like, we got to have a teaser to really make them interested.
Yeah. I'm going to clip that for sure.
Great. Fun.
Awesome.
Fun.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting me.